Hello and welcome to the second part of our eight-part international webinar series titled Gandhi's Legacies, Reflections and Reappraisals. We deem it a privilege to have as our speaker Professor Talat Ahmed of the University of Edinburgh. Our distinguished speaker today is a scholar who has researched in several fields within the humanities and social sciences. She is currently associated with the School of History, Classics, and Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. She has been a student of sociology at the University of Leeds in the past. She's taught sociology. She got her doctoral degree from School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. She has held several fellowships, and she has been teaching at the University of Edinburgh since the year 2011. She has numerous publications to her credit, including a very important work titled Literature and Politics in the Age of Nationalism, the Progressive Episode in South Asia, 1932 to 1956. This was published by Routledge. And most recently, she is the author of what I presume is a biography of sorts of Mohandas Gandhi, which is titled Mohandas Gandhi, Experiments in Civil Disobedience, published by University of Chicago Press in 2019. And all our viewers who have joined us here today, I would urge them to read this book, which reflects on Gandhi not only in terms of what Gandhi was, in terms of the individual that he was or the political figure that he was, but the resonances of Gandhi's ideas, the legacy of Gandhi in our contemporary times. There's a lot that we get to see when we read Professor Ahmed's book. I welcome you, Professor Ahmed, to the talk, and before she begins her presentation, I'll very briefly introduce our viewers, our participant, to Professor Ahmed's lecture today. She is, like the title of the talk says, Gandhi at 150 years of Gandhi. She's going to look at the impact of Gandhi, the influence of Gandhi, and the various and the way people have responded to Gandhi. And she looks at the legacy of Gandhi in terms of the various kinds of responses Gandhi has received. People, on the one hand, Gandhi is appropriated, Gandhi is revered, like Ashish Nandi said, sometimes Gandhi is used as a post-colonial totem. But at the same time, we've had movements which have been very critical of Gandhi, calling for reappraisal of Gandhi. For instance, the movement which started in Ghana a few years ago, calling for Gandhi's statue to be removed from the university premises and so on. And we have numerous instances. And Professor Ahmed is going to reflect on those issues by looking at some of the contradictions within Gandhi. She's going to highlight, she's going to draw attention to those contradictions, maybe to those ambivalences and so on. So without further ado, I request Professor Ahmed to begin with her presentation, which will be followed by Q&A. Thank you, Professor Ahmed. The stage is all yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shazwat, for that very generous introduction. Hello and good afternoon, I should say, to everybody at the University of North Orissa in the Department of English. I am very grateful for this opportunity to share my ideas and my work, and particularly about Gandhi. So yes, as Shazwat says, the title of my talk is Gandhi at 150, Rethinking India's Nonviolent Revolutionary. And I think that when we reflect on how Gandhi from 2019 onwards, we had the 150th anniversary, birth anniversary. And this has really provided, I think, a very rich opportunity for us to reflect upon Gandhi as a pivotal figure of the 20th century, not just in terms of India and the subcontinent, in terms of its history, but I also think really for global history, for us to rethink his life and his legacy, particularly in the light of developments in the contemporary world. Gandhi is a global icon for the 21st century, is very much seen as the apostle of peace. And he has been commemorated throughout the last year, and the commemorations are continuing into this year. For me in Britain, it was actually quite striking that in 2019, we had a climate change activist movement that erupted into Britain. And this climate change activist movement really invoked Gandhi's name, as we had thousands of young people participating in peaceful civil disobedience. And it was one of the largest civil disobedience campaigns that Britain had seen in recent history. This group, of course, was called Extinction Rebellion. And I want to really begin, I suppose, by sharing some images, if I may. I hope that you're all able to see these images. Do let me know if for any reason it's not visible. So I'm assuming that if I don't hear anything from you, Shazwat, everybody is able to see these images. Okay, so this image here, I said that in Britain we had a movement called Extinction Rebellion. And it was very interesting because the authors of this movement, when they erupted onto the British political scene, they said that the social contract had been broken. And one of their activists said that therefore it is not only our right, but our moral duty to bypass the government's inaction and flagrant dereliction of duty. One of the authors also went on, her name was Jenny Jones. She's actually a Green Party member and also a former peer in the House of Lords in this country. She said that basically conventional politics has failed us. It's even failed me, and I'm part of the system. So people have no other choice. And in this particular slide, you see an image of an activist, a group of Extinction Rebellion activists in India itself. And really the emblematic notion of non-violent direct action is something that we've been familiar with in Britain over the last century. But it's also something that, of course, is very, very much associated with Gandhi in terms of his own lifetime. Now, Gandhi called his particular brand of movement Satyagraha, obviously meaning truth force. And in this particular doctrine, the aim of any non-violent conflict is to convert your opponent, to win over your opponent, to win over their mind, to win over their hearts, and to persuade them of the rightness of your particular point of view. And in this sense, Gandhi is not simply the most famous founding father of India, but he's arguably the key starting point for activists and theorists, such as the authors of Extinction Rebellion, be it in Britain or anywhere else in Europe, and also, I would argue, in India as well. He's seen as being the principal authority on non-violent civil disobedience, and that this is the most effective strategy to ensure social change for the betterment of humanity. In this sense, in my book, I quote Hegel and his language when he said that we can perhaps see Gandhi as a world historic figure whose impact on the 20th century can be compared to the likes of Vladimir Lenin or a Mao. But unlike the latter two, Gandhi is someone who appears to be squeaky clean. He isn't seen to be sullied by issues to do with violence or by compromise. The great George Orwell, British writer, writing in January 1949, he commented after Gandhi's death by saying that Gandhi left a clean smell behind him, in contrast to most politicians of his time. And I think this is also partly something which helps to set Gandhi apart from any other great activist. Gandhi has been sanctified, he has been mythologized, not least by one of his great admirers, Martin Luther King, who himself travelled to India in 1959, and he paid tribute to Gandhi on many occasions. But in that year, in 1959, he said that Gandhi was able to mobilise and galvanise more people in his lifetime than any other person in the history of the world. Now, this is absolutely tremendous. To say that one individual could galvanize more people than any other person in the entire world is incredibly significant. And of course, for Martin Luther King, he was thinking particularly of Gandhi's famous Salt March in 1930. And I will come back to that a little bit later. But it's also quite interesting that in reflecting upon Gandhi, another British writer, Perry Anderson, writing in 2012 in the London Review of Books, he commented on Gandhi in this manner by saying that what set him apart from other leading nationalist figures was this. He was a first-class organizer and fundraiser, diligent, efficient, meticulous. He rebuilt Congress from the bottom, endowing it with a permanent executive at national level, vernacular units at provincial level, local bases at district level, and delegates proportionate to population, not to speak of an ample treasury. At the same time, though, temperamentally in many ways an autocrat, politically he did not care about power in itself and was an excellent mediator between different figures and groups, both within Congress and among its variated social supports. Finally, though no great orator, he was an exceptionally quick and fluent communicator, as the 100 volumes of his articles, books, letters, cables, far exceeding the output of Marx or Lenin, let alone Mao, testify. To these political gifts were added personal qualities of a ready warmth, impish wit, and iron will. It is no surprise that so magnetic a force would attract such passionate admiration at the time and since. Now, this is praise indeed from someone who isn't a particular devotee of Gandhi's. But of course, as Shaswat mentioned in his introduction, we have also had some controversies in relationship to Gandhi. And we see this particularly in a movement that began in Ghana, calling for Gandhi must fall. As you can see in these images, pictures here from the University of Accra, and also in Malawi. Similarly, we have seen this in South Africa, where, of course, Gandhi spent over 2 decades of his lifetime. Here we have a statue of him that is being vandalized in Johannesburg. And this important book here, The South African Gandhi, Stretcher Bearer of Empire, this book, the authors of which 2 South African scholars, Ashwin Desai and Ghulam Vahed, they have challenged the sanctification of Gandhi, particularly in relationship to non-violence, and also, of course, to sorry, I'm just making sure that I'm not. That's okay, yes, sorry. Particularly in relationship to non-violence, and also in relationship to whether or not he should be seen as a hero in terms of South Africa. There are all kinds of questions over race that have been raised about Gandhi's time in South Africa and whether or not he was a racist. There have also been issues around sexism, which I'm happy to answer. But one other thing I also want to say is, of course, how Gandhi's legacy is seen. Here, it's quite interesting that we have Gandhi, as he was, seated at his spinning wheel. But also in 2017, we had Narendra Modi as Prime Minister of India in a similar pose. But there's also other controversies over this. Perhaps this is a little known fact that Gandhi did go to Italy, to fascist Italy under Mussolini. And here there is a photograph of him meeting with a young fascist troop, which again I will comment on much later on. And finally, I just want to state this quote here from one of his admirers, of course, Jawaharlal Nehru, who said, following this incident in Charitora, which I will come on to, said, "Must we train the 300 and odd millions of India in the theory and practice of non-violent action before we could go forward? And even so, how many of us could say that under extreme provocation from the police, you'd be able to remain perfectly peaceful?" Okay. So let's go forward then. The key thing about Gandhi, of course, is in terms of what I try to do in my book, is to look at the whole question of violence and non-violence. Gandhi, who's seen as being the champion of the masses and the oppressed, giving voice to millions of the mass of ordinary people. Is he a non-violent revolutionary who can truly be represented as a guide to mass activism from below? This, for me, is quite a pertinent question in the 21st century. Now, there have been other biographies that came out in the run-up to the 150th birth centenary, particularly Ramchandra Guha's second volume of his biography that came out in 2018. And in this, there are some very interesting conclusions that he reaches, particularly in terms of looking at some correspondence from some of Gandhi's closest confidants at the time. And Guha writes that the imperatives of pluralism and democracy compel one to stand on Gandhi's side. And this is particularly the case with the kind of world that we are living in. I suspect that Guha was also perhaps thinking about India under Narendra Modi and the polarization that is taking place in Indian society. But I would argue that by representing the history of India as being based upon the great man, produces yet another hagiographical piece of biographical work. And if we do that alone, then that tends to gloss over many weaknesses and silences. And I think from my point of view, when I was writing my biography of Gandhi, it was quite important to have a critical gaze upon Gandhi's engagement with civil disobedience. And in this sense, my book is an attempt to grapple with some of the broader issues surrounding Gandhi as a champion of the masses and as an activist from below, engaging in experiments of civil disobedience. Now, I mentioned the Salt March earlier, and I really want to, I suppose, begin with this. In 1930, of course, Gandhi led his famous Salt March. And Nehru, who, as we saw, could be quite critical of Gandhi, nevertheless, remembering 1930, Nehru recalled the civil disobedience campaign in this manner, saying that year in 1930 was full of dramatic situations and inspiring happenings. What surprised most was the amazing power of Gandhiji to inspire and enthuse a whole people. There was something almost hypnotic about it, and we remembered the words used by Gokhale about him, how he had the power of making heroes out of clay. And as I said, we must remember that Nehru had been quite skeptical and critical about Gandhi, but also skeptical about the SALT campaign. But in this hagiographical declaration of this momentous year, it is indicative of how far Gandhi had travelled by the year 1930. He'd moved from being a local leader to a national leader, and 1930 would also mark the stage of him as a truly global figure. The political commentator in Britain, Andrew Marr, last year commented that in 1930, only 3 people had achieved instant global recognition: Charlie Chaplin, Hitler, and Gandhi. And it was the Salt March that really made Gandhi into an international celebrity. And again, if I go back to my screen here, here we see images of Gandhi on the front cover of Time magazine, the American publication. One which is referring to Gandhi as Saint Gandhi on the 31st of March in 1930, and then one obviously in 1947. But the one that I liked the best from Time magazine was this one. This one here, which is taken from January 1931, where Gandhi was declared the Man of the Year. And this really symbolizes, in my view, the global acclaim that Gandhi had at that time. Okay, so what's interesting about the Salt March is that to this day, scholars still argue that this was actually quite not just an epic campaign, but it was a critical juncture paving the way towards independence. The scholar Judith Brown, of course, who's written quite widely on Gandhi over many decades, she argues that the Salt March was critical, playing a central role in building the Indian National Congress organization and also in providing popular legitimacy. She states that although mass displays of protest alone did not expel the imperialists, they profoundly altered the political landscape. And she goes on to argue that civil resistance was a crucial part of the environment in which the British had to make decisions about when and how to leave India. Now, at the time, Gandhi had many admirers in India, obviously, but also abroad. One such admirer was a British man, Reginald Reynolds. He was a Quaker and also a very early admirer of Gandhi. He founded the Friends of India Society in 1930, which is a society dedicated to raising public awareness in Britain about the injustices of British rule in India. Now, Reynolds had travelled to India in 1929, and he was with Gandhi at the time of the Salt campaign. Reynolds went to Ahmedabad, to Lahore, to Bombay, and also to South India before leaving in 1930. In his book, 1931 book, India, Gandhi and the World and World Peace, Reynolds makes the case for Gandhi being a revolutionary, claiming that Satyagraha stands in opposition to both imperial violence and revolutionary violence, and that Satyagraha is the antithesis of fear, since it is the opposition of the unarmed to the armed. To get another sense of how Gandhi, and particularly his brand of non-violent civil disobedience, was perceived by his admirers, and also to grasp, I suppose, the significance of Gandhi at this time, another admirer, Muriel Lester, who's also a British woman, she was a nonconformist social reformer from East London, and she went to India for the first time in 3 months in 1926. And about that visit, she writes in her letters about a British magistrate that she met at a dinner party, who explains to her what Gandhi had achieved. And these were his words. 10 years ago, if a coolie had suddenly crossed my path and frightened the horse I was riding, I would probably have sworn at him and shouted, "Get out of the way, you." He would have cowered before me and disappeared. Now, I should not shout at a coolie like that. For if I did, he wouldn't disappear. He'd stand facing me with complete assurance, look me full in the face and politely inquire, why should I move? To Muriel Lester, this explained Gandhi's power in terms of injecting a sense of pride and defiance amongst Indians. Now, Gandhi, during the Salt campaign, was interviewed by foreign journalists who wrote articles about the Epic March, which were, of course, transmitted back home. Apart from the world's press, there were also 3 Bombay cinema companies who were shooting newsreel footage, and therefore all this turned Gandhi into a household name, not just across India, but particularly in Europe and also in the United States. Nearing the end of the march, Gandhi declared, "I want world sympathy in this battle of right against might." And in this sense, I would argue, it clearly demonstrates that Gandhi had become a master of media management and of stage management, directing his particular satyagraha in 1930 with precision. And we can see the painstaking planning that went into this march. Firstly, the route of the map of the march had to be mapped. Gandhi utilized some trusted followers who were tasked with this. Gandhi wanted the Salt March to go through a series of villages where he would be able to promote his program, particularly of sanitation, of personal hygiene, of abstention from alcohol, as well as an end to child marriages and untouchability. On this march, he continued to write letters and news articles for his various publications. At each village, Gandhi collected information about the population, about the educational opportunities there, and land revenue. This furnished him with facts that he was able to then write about and therefore communicate with his readers about the British presence in India. Now, Gandhi's method here is very striking. He is diligent, and also the devotees that he employs are also diligent. Gandhi sent a vanguard of satyagrahis to prepare the route of the march in the villages and in the towns. And in this, they had to ensure that all kinds of provision was organized, such as food provision, sleeping space, toilets. Every marcher was also instructed to carry a woven bag. And in this bag, they had a bedroll, a change of clothes, a journal, a takli, and a drinking mug. These accessories were complemented by their attire, which were made up of simple sandals and clothes that were made of khadi. Now, in this, an emphatic statement was being made about the nature of the protest. Gandhi also required each marcher to pray, spin, and to keep a diary on a daily basis. Now, again, I would argue this clearly indicates that Gandhi had become a master of stage management. He was directing his satyagraha not just with precision, but with absolute control. And therefore, what does this suggest to us about Gandhi as being, if it were, a political novice who was untarnished by the grubby business of politics? What I would argue is that Gandhi had drawn lessons from his previous protests, of course, in South Africa, but also the protests that he had initiated in 1919 and in 1920 to 22 over non-cooperation. In these protests, Gandhi had learnt from the previous experiences, and he was determined to set the scope, to prescribe the methods and the intended outcomes without any danger of unruly elements taking matters into their own hands and producing, yet again, a Himalayan blunder. And in this, I argue that what Gandhi demonstrates are his skills as a shrewd political operator, where he weighs every action, every gesture, and every public utterance with the skill and tenacity of a forensic mind. And therefore, I argue that this does not demonstrate Gandhi as being a political novice. Now, I want to jump back a decade from the civil disobedience campaign to the Charitora Incident in 1922. That is 98 years, almost 98 years ago. And I want to look at this particular activity. So this incident, which took place in the United Provinces in North India, it takes place in the middle of the non-cooperation movement, where on the 4th of February that year, protesters had answered the call for non-cooperation. In this particular area, they were demonstrating against high food prices in the local marketplace. The fact that this is what ignited them to protest demonstrates that many issues were being brought into the non-cooperation movement. And in this sense, non-cooperation fed into a mood of localized discontent over material conditions. Now, the demonstrators, as they were protesting, had been beaten back by the local police, and some of their leaders had been arrested. They were locked up in the police station at Charitora. In response to this, a protest against the police was called on the 5th of February that year, and some 2,000 to 2,500 protesters gathered in front of the police station demanding the release of their leaders. Now, what happened here is that armed police were dispatched to control the situation. As a result, the crowd started shouting anti-government slogans at them, and initially the police were ordered to fire warning shots into the air. But this only agitated the crowd further, who then began to throw stones at the police. The Indian sub-inspector ordered the police to open fire, and 3 protesters were killed and several others were wounded. This infuriated the crowd further, who eventually set the chowki on ablaze. As a result, all the Indian policemen who were inside were killed. Most of them were burnt to death, and several appeared to have been killed by the crowd at the entrance to the chowki, and others had their bodies thrown back onto the fire. Now, this was absolutely horrific. There is no doubt about this. 22 policemen and the son of a policeman were killed in this violence. In the trial, which followed and lasted some 8 months, 228 people were charged with rioting and arson. Out of this, 6 people died whilst they were still in police custody, and 172 were sentenced to death. On the 20th of April in 1923, the Allahabad High Court reviewed the death sentences. 19 death verdicts were confirmed, and 110 were sentenced to life imprisonment, and the rest were sentenced to long terms of imprisonment. Now, as before, Gandhi, of course, was very distressed by the violence, which supposedly had been organized, he believed, in his name. And writing in his publication Young India on the 16th of February 1922, he wrote this under the heading, Crimes of Charitora. They, meaning the crowd, probably hacked the constables, their countrymen and fellow beings, with my name on their lips. I would suffer every humiliation, every torture, absolute ostracism, and death itself to prevent the movement from becoming violent or a precursor of violence. Following this, under his instructions, Congress issued a resolution at its Barzoli session. It stated this: the Working Committee deplores the inhuman conduct of the mob at Charitora in having brutally murdered constables and wantonly burnt the police thana, and tenders its sympathy to the families of the bereaved. Now, what I think is quite interesting here is that in this statement, which of course was as a result of Gandhi, the protesters are here described as being a mob, and there is concern that is given for the bereaved of the policemen, but there is no concern for the bereaved of any of the activists. There is no concern for any of the casualties on their side. Now, Gandhi, to be sure, his position was always to condemn violence, but I would argue that he was particular about who was to blame for the violence. And therefore, I want to suggest a few questions. Does Gandhi inadvertently give credence to the notion of Indians as being an unruly and unworthy mob, and therefore that they are unworthy of independence and self-determination? By consigning the mass of Indians to a stage army to be orchestrated and given the roles that he assigns to them, marshalled according to his precepts, does this not reiterate a traditional Orientalist perception of the Indian masses as being unprepared, not well versed in or capable of understanding the art of politics, and as such they cannot be masters or mistresses of their own destiny? Writing in Young India 2 years later, on the 24th of May in 1924, Gandhi stated this: my non-violence does not admit of running away from danger and leaving dear ones unprotected. Between violence and cowardly flight, I can only prefer violence to cowardice. Now, there has been a growing literature which is examining the meaning of ahimsa as non-harm and what is the meaning of satyagraha. But the point I want to make here is that if we were to accept what Gandhi writes in 1924, then did the people of Charitora not refuse to run away from danger and leave their dear ones unprotected? Did they not display sufficient act of courage in the face of danger by the police? So therefore, the question has to be put: why is it that Gandhi was prepared to condemn them and yet not say anything about the actions of the police? Now, even sympathetic scholars like Bhikkhu Parekh in his biography of Gandhi, have admitted that Gandhi had anxieties, particularly about violence. Parekh puts it like this. He says that Gandhi worried that once violence became respectable and organized, the masses would want to use it against their native exploiters, thereby dividing the nationalist movement. And I think this is where the key lies. Parekh goes on to say that Gandhi knew that the poor were angry and frustrated. He was also aware of the role of the poor in the Russian and Chinese revolutions, and therefore was deeply afraid that once they were mobilized and their expectations aroused, large-scale violence was bound to result, which neither he nor Congress was able to control. I want to move on now. In my book, there are many examples that I go through in terms of Gandhi's experiences in civil disobedience. But I want to roll forward by 20-odd years to 1946, because in February 1946, the Royal Indian Navy mutiny had begun. And this was a mass strike that takes place of Indian sailors on board ships and also at shore establishments. It began in Bombay, but it spread rapidly throughout British India at the time, spreading to other key port cities such as Karachi, Calcutta, and also Madras. And the slogans that they had were strike for Bombay, release the 11,000 Indian National Army prisoners, and also Jai Hind. And it came to involve some 78 ships and 20 shore establishments involving 20,000 sailors. It was a tremendous, and I would argue quite an inspirational struggle taking place. It was inspirational partly because this was a truly national movement, and particularly at this moment in time in 1946, in that it united Hindus and Muslim sailors together. Their grievances entailed poor food rations that they were subjected to, the lack of a career advancement, but also, of course, the racism that they faced on a daily basis at the hands of Navy personnel. The feeling across India at this time was so strong that even the Gurkhas, who had been defined as being one of the martial races and therefore as being very loyal to the British throughout their history, even the Gurkhas in Karachi had refused to fire upon the striking sailors, even though they had been instructed to do so by their British masters. The mutineers also took down the Union Jack flag, and instead they hoisted up 3 flags: the flag of the Indian National Congress, of the All India Muslim League, and of the Communist Party of India, in a symbolic display of national unity. And thousands of people brought food for these rebels and these strikers. There was mass fraternization taking place at the harbour with the sailors, and eventually a general strike in support of them involved 300,000 people across the city of Bombay. And this also spread to Karachi and other port cities. Now, Nehru himself understood the importance of this. He said that the whole country was in the throes of serious discontent. We are sitting on the edge of a volcano which may erupt at any moment. A spark set ablaze Bombay, Calcutta, and Karachi. These pre-storm conditions are not limited to the big cities, but are found in even the remotest villages. Nehru understood the significance of what these strikes meant in terms of how they had hit a nerve of the Indian sentiment against the British across India, and also a sense of unity. Now, for me as a historian, it's very interesting, because in most school textbooks, the role of nonviolence and about Gandhi is seen as being preeminent. And the place of the Royal Indian the Royal Indian Naval mutinies is usually dismissed with a few cursory paragraphs. And I think it's quite important to challenge this. And it's quite interesting because when you look through the records, to get a sense of how the British felt about India in 1946, you have to go back to actually the statements of the British themselves. And in 1956, a letter describes a conversation between Clement Attlee, who was the Labour Prime Minister at the time of independence. And this is a letter, a piece of correspondence between him and the Chief Justice Chakrabarti, who of the Calcutta High Court, who had been the Governor General of West Bengal in 1947. Now, Chakrabarti writes to Attlee and he says, my direct question was that since Gandhi's Quit India movement had tapered off quite some time ago, and in 1947, there was no new compelling situation that had arisen which would necessitate a hasty British departure, why did the British have to leave? Attlee's reply stated that the principal reason, amongst others, was the erosion of loyalty to the British Crown amongst the Indian Army and the Indian Navy as a result of the military activities of Subhash Chandra Bose. Chakrabarti eventually probed Attlee much further and asked about the influence of Gandhi. Hearing this question, Attlee's lips became twisted in a sarcastic smile, and he slowly chewed out the word minimal. Now, given that Attlee could state with such conviction that Gandhi played very little role in deciding at what point the British were going to leave India, but also demonstrates that the Royal Mutiny, the Navy Mutiny, was much more significant than Gandhi. I think certainly for me as a historian, this invites us to interrogate not just the role of Gandhi, but also to look at movements from below, such as the Indian Mutiny. Now, it's very interesting because, of course, this mutiny had not been initiated by Gandhi, and rather than supporting it, Gandhi condemned it. On the 3rd of March 1946, he criticized the strikers for mutinying as being thoughtless and ignorant. He also insulted the mutineers by declaring that the Swaraj is not to be obtained by what is going on now in Bombay, Calcutta, and Karachi. This is an unbecoming example for India. In addition, the leaders of Congress and the Muslim League, they also refused to back the mutineers and effectively sabotaged the strike by sending in their representatives to broker an agreement. Nationalist leaders, I argue, feared a revolt from below, and they did their utmost to try and call off the mutiny. And both Jinnah and Patel were successful in doing this, in trying to persuade the mutineers to surrender. Now, not only was the mutiny called off, but none of the demands of the sailors were ever met. And I argue that in some respects, what this points to are some of the shortcomings of Gandhi's approach, and particularly his version of non-violent civil disobedience, because his satyagraha is based upon an appeal to religiosity of individuals. And I argue that this is woefully inadequate when it was tested at a critical juncture for Indian history, where by 1946, of course, there was terrible communal frenzy right the way across India. But the fact that you could have a mutiny which had paralyzed not just the port cities, but was also terrifying the British, who had been the preeminent power for over 200 years in India, into such a panic, displays that not only was unity possible between Hindus and Muslims, but that Gandhi, who as the leader of non-violence, Gandhi, who purported to stand for Indian unity, he should have nurtured this unity. The fact that he doesn't, the fact that he sees this and saw this as being an unbecoming example for India, I think raises many questions about him. And for me, these questions relate to Gandhi's elitism, particularly in relationship to class and also in relationship to caste. It exposes, in my view, a critique that Gandhi had, which was that the masses were not capable of governing themselves. The masses were not capable of taking decisions for themselves. And therefore, what Gandhi's model, I believe, adheres to is a top model, is a top-down model of how to do politics. Now, I want to conclude, because my time is coming to an end, with this, that we hear a lot about the term satyagraha, but I also want to throw in the concept of duragraha, implying prejudgment and stubbornness. I think that just as satyagraha is emblematic of Gandhi in terms of his particular version of nonviolent civil disobedience, this is accompanied by duragraha, where Gandhi also has a firm stubbornness and a refusal to entertain a criticism of his particular strategy. And this, I think, leads to further questions, and that is the degree to which Gandhi was open to all ideas. Gandhi did read a lot, and in my book I go through some of the readings that he does. But one of the other things I argue is that I think his readings were quite selective. He was quite happy to read the New Testament. He was quite happy to read William Ruskin, because these were thinkers that he was able to take something from, or Tolstoy, for example, ideas which in some ways would provide further justification for his own original thinking about nonviolence. If there were ideas which were critical about his particular strategy, or particularly critical about his ethos, then he was not willing to entertain these ideas. And part of my book is about arguing that every time in the course of Gandhi's life a movement from below evolved, Gandhi was quick to be critical of it. And not just to be critical of it, but to distance himself, to condemn it, and therefore not to give a lead to this. So I suppose my conclusion is that Gandhi at 150 does merit serious engagement on the part of activists, on the part of scholars, and on the part of students. But I think the serious engagement has to be in terms of his ideas, particularly his ideas in terms of religion and his own particular ethos to do with pluralism, democracy, and also mass participatory politics, and as well as his strategy for nonviolent revolution. And I think if we are able to do this, then we will be paying true tribute to Gandhi, but to do this in a critical way, because if we don't do this in a critical manner, then in many respects, what we are really doing is just reiterating a view of the grand narrative of history as just being about great men. And in many respects, Gandhi didn't see himself as being necessarily a great man. So if we are to honor him, then we have to examine his legacy in a critical light, particularly in the light of movements as they erupt in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ahmed, for what was an extremely engaging session, and for that very important intervention of yours, for reminding us that how we need to have a proper sense of history while talking of individuals who are important, who almost enjoy, let's say, a saintly status in countries like in India. So it's very important what you said about Gandhi. We need to look at the various aspects of Gandhi's thought instead of whitewashing history. And as we know, history has always been a very contested terrain. It continues to be the same today. And we therefore need to look at several aspects of his thought and situate him in history instead of just thinking of him as a figure who's a cutout larger than his context, his milieu, his society, and so on. So we're extremely thankful to you for your presentation. We shall now take a few questions. Is that all right?
Of course.
Yes. Oh, great. So we have a question from a young student, Neha, who's rather curious about Gandhi's response, or let's say, his lack of adequate engagement in or intervention in the Bhagat Singh issue. What do you have to say to that? I think this is about the execution of Bhagat Singh. Could he have prevented it, or could he not? A young and curious student asks this question.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. Yes, the story of Bhagat Singh is both an incredibly inspirational one and also extreme tragedy. A young man, so terribly young, who was executed by the British. It's very interesting because Bhagat Singh, when he was executed, Gandhi did attempt to intervene. It's not the case that Gandhi was totally ignorant or that he stood to one side. He certainly wasn't in favor of the death sentence being carried out, and did instead attempt to privately argue with the powers that be to have the death sentence commuted. So to that extent, we can say that, yes, Gandhi did show a certain level of concern. However, what is also undeniable is that Gandhi could have done a lot more. Gandhi, and part of the reason that perhaps Gandhi didn't is because his total disapproval of the methods of Bhagat Singh, his disapproval of Bhagat Singh's ideas, his methods, his strategy. And I mean, what I find quite interesting is that Bhagat Singh was a great reader. He was such a young man, but he called himself a revolutionary. He read voraciously in terms of Marxist writings. He saw himself as a Marxist. He was dedicated to this, dedicated to revolutionary ideas, which of course is something that Gandhi was not. It's interesting that Gandhi is seen as being a revolutionary of non-violence, but of course Gandhi, whether or not Gandhi deserves to be called a revolutionary, I think is quite a moot point. I would argue that actually Gandhi was much more a conciliator, a class conciliator, and also a caste conciliator, whereas Bhagat Singh was not. He was irredeemably of the revolution and saw himself as that. So Gandhi could have gone much further, in my view. And particularly whilst Bhagat obviously was still alive, the fact that he didn't intervene as forcefully as he could have done, I think is a problem. But I think it's a political problem. It isn't a moral question. It is a political problem. And that's because for Gandhi, the particular strategy, the particular ideology that Bhagat Singh represented did not in any shape or form correspond to his own. And so Gandhi had enough wherewithal to understand that there was disquiet in the country over what the British were going to do with Bhagat Singh. But he didn't use the full weight of his stature to prevent that man from being killed. I mean, having said that, I don't think Bhagat Singh himself would have accepted Gandhi's help. So I hope that helps to address that question.
Thank you for your response. We have a couple of questions from Manas. One is, do you think that it's because Gandhi's supporters and Gandhians, let's say fans or admirers of Gandhi, who raised him to a pedestal, to the status of a saint, is that the reason which invites a lot of criticism towards Gandhi? That's his first question. His second question is, in what ways would Gandhi be considered relevant today, especially in the academic circles, if at all he can be considered relevant? Two questions from Manas.
Okay, thank you, Manas, for those questions. Gandhi certainly is relevant in academia and in political circles, very much so. When I began by talking about Extinction Rebellion in the UK and also other sister organizations across the world, I think that demonstrates the power of Gandhi, because in each of these movements, Gandhi's name has been invoked. I think what is quite striking is that I was in India in January and early February. I was in Delhi, and I read about the big protests over the Citizenship Amendment Act, and particularly at Shaheen Bagh in Delhi, which entailed women. And all of these women were invoking Gandhi's name. They talked about their protest as being in the name of civil disobedience, as being satyagrahis in the tradition of Gandhi. And that protest lasted 101 days before the lockdown eventually ended it, which made it one of probably the largest civil disobedience campaign in Indian history. So Gandhi is still very much alive in political circles. In this country, when we have protests by activists over climate change, they use Gandhi's methods. They say that we are being non-violent. They have mass protests where they link arms together. They sit down together. When the police come to arrest them, they do not resist arrest. They go peacefully to jails. And this is something that we've been seeing the world over, even in the recent Black Lives Matter movement that we've had in such a pronounced way in Britain and in the United States. Again, in many of these cases, what we have been witnessing are people who are saying that they are using Gandhi's methods of nonviolence. I think within academia, the fact that the man has been dead for over 70 years, and yet there are still books that are being written about him, both popular books as well as serious academic books, as well as children's books about Gandhi. Again, I think it speaks of a need in our society, because the world that we are living in is a world which is racked by inequality. It is racked by injustice. Even though we live in the most technologically advanced age of human civilization, nevertheless, injustice and inequality and extremities of wealth and poverty persist in a way perhaps that they did not do in previous eras. And I think precisely because of those sorts of issues, someone like Gandhi is always going to be a draw. He is always going to be an attraction. And I think in some ways that is a positive thing, but it is only going to be positive if people are going to seriously engage with Gandhi in terms of his ideas and read his ideas and read about the history of Gandhi. It's quite easy, I think, for people to just have quite a candy floss image of Gandhi as presented, for example, particularly in Richard Attenborough's film, which, by the way, I think is a very good film and people should see it. But I think it also does raise questions. And so I think it is quite important to understand that, yes, Gandhi still has a mass political draw. And within academia, certainly academics write about him, but also students engage with Gandhi. I don't know exactly what it's like in Orissa, but certainly at Edinburgh University, I teach a course on Gandhi to fourth year students, final year students at undergraduate level. And it's one of the most popular courses ever. It's always full every single year because people have an enormous desire and thirst to engage with Gandhi in terms of trying to make sense of him in the contemporary world. So that was, I think, on the second question. The first question, what was the first one again, please, that Manas asked?
Just a second, I'll just get to it. Yes, the first question was, do you think it's because of Gandhi's admirers who raised him to a pedestal, to a saintly status, and is that the reason which invites a lot of criticism towards Gandhi? Is it not just because of Gandhi's action, but because of his admirers who sort of eulogized him to an extent whereby there were a lot of harsh responses towards Gandhi?
Absolutely, yes. I think that a figure like Gandhi clearly does excite passions, and both within his lifetime and even more so, I would suggest, since his death. Those who are his admirers, either based upon deep knowledge of him or based upon very little knowledge of him, yes, their desire to basically turn him into a little brown saint in the globe, which is how he was referred to by the civil rights movement in America in the 1950s and 60s. That, yes, this is, they present him as being so clean, so whiter than thou, that in some ways their particular perception and their promotion of a particular image of Gandhi as being very sanctified, as being very sacred, in some respects does invite criticism. But I would argue that, in both cases, it doesn't really matter whether one is an admirer or one is a critic. I think that both have to be based upon some kind of real engagement with his ideas and his writings and with his thought and in terms of scholarship. Because if they're not, then they're just based upon a gut feeling, and gut feelings, can be very helpful in some scenarios, but I don't think they're particularly useful when we're talking about political engagement or political strategy.
Thank you for that response. Shika has a question, which is, if we understand Gandhi as being distrustful of the masses, how do we look at his ability to empower them through what I think the left leader Hiren Mukhopadhyay, what he calls abhay, or courage, that he granted courage to the masses? How do we look at that?
it's certainly undeniable that Gandhi's presence on the Indian national scene had a deep impact, both in terms of the British, who saw him as a menace, particularly in the 19-teens and the 1920s, and even in the 1930s. And it also, therefore, had a big, deep impact in terms of the consciousness of Indians. One cannot explain the ability and the readiness of peasants, of rich peasants, poor peasants, of workers, of the middle classes, of students, etc. Their willingness to follow Gandhi and be involved in campaigns that he initiated speaks volumes about his powers as a leader. Of course they do. And it would be churlish to deny this. And so in that sense, yes, one could argue that there is an element of courage, an element of pride that is inserted by Gandhi's very presence and his refusal to bow down before the British into the Indian, into the colonial Indian consciousness. And similarly, one could argue that that was also apparent in South Africa. But I suppose that there are two things I would say about this. Firstly, abaya was not something that was brought into Indian consciousness by India. It existed, by Gandhi. It existed before Gandhi. And similarly in South Africa, the Indian community in South Africa had a long history of opposition, had a long history of conflict with the colonial state there before Gandhi. And similarly inside of India, it isn't true that Gandhi himself becomes the epicenter through which the Indian masses find courage and therefore the ability to challenge society. I think that is quite important, because otherwise you are then suggesting that somehow the Indian masses were just nothing. They were just a blob of plasticine that were just waiting to be molded by Gandhi. And I don't think that particular view of human history stands up in any particular scenario, geographical scenario. But the second thing I would also say is that Gandhi did have a skepticism towards the masses as well, which is part of the reason why he believed very much in terms of herding them. He saw himself, even though he didn't like to see himself as a political leader, nevertheless, he was a guru for them. He saw himself as being a spiritual leader for the mass of humanity. He saw himself as, and the particular lifestyle that he led, his own personal convictions, he saw this as being a moral crusade. His idea of ridding India of the British was not just about ridding them politically, but also, as he saw it, a true satyagrahi had to be a satyagrahi that was truly free, not just in body, but also in mind. And this is because his own particular ethos is very much embedded with his own religious understanding and philosophy. And Gandhi believed that this was the true way for everyone. Now, it's okay for him to have that viewpoint, but to somehow then be dismissive of those who do not, as if somehow they are lesser, I think that does betray a certain paternalism. I think that does speak about a level of elitism in terms of his thinking, that only those who were sufficiently educated with formal education, only those that were that had the ear of the British, only those that were capable of conversing at that level, that somehow they are the only ones that could be entrusted to lead the people. And I think that there are profound questions there about elitism.
Thank you for the answer. Shubhra, I guess, has a very important question. She says, your reading of Charitora is insightful, and it has got me thinking about Gandhi with regard to his leadership abilities. So she she has this question. Could you please reflect briefly on political leadership and what makes Gandhi an effective political leader?
Oh, so that is quite a big question. I mean, early on in my paper, when I gave you that quotation from Perry Anderson about how Gandhi was an efficient organizer, I think that Perry Anderson's observation of Gandhi was very apt. Gandhi, one must remember, he was trained in law, trained as a barrister. And even though he then turned his back on the law profession, nevertheless, the skills that he imbibed in his 3 years of training in London served him very well throughout the rest of his life. He was able to operate in a very shrewd and canny fashion. He was able to adjudicate between different groups very well. If you think, for example, in his very early campaigns in 1917 and 1918, when he's in the village of Champaran, or when he is adjudicating between the workers at the Ahmedabad mills with their employers, what he does in that situation is that he brings all his skills, all his knowledge of the law, all his abilities to play in terms of collecting all the facts on the ground. That's what he instructs his disciples to do in Champaran and in Ahmedabad and in Kedah. And he then brings all that written evidence before the British to demonstrate the iniquity of what the plantation owners are doing, for example, in Champaran or in Kedah, or what the mill owners are doing in terms of not respecting their workers enough. But at the same time, he also wants the workers, and he also wants the villagers of Kedah and Champaran to be respectful of the plantation owners, of the mill worker owner, of the mill owners. And Gandhi, in this sense, wants to balance off the different interests of the competing and conflicting parties, because he wants to bring about some sense of harmony. And he firmly, and I think he's very sincere in this, he really believed that this was possible. To my mind, I don't really think this is possible. I think you can end up with a sort of truce, but I don't believe it's necessarily going to be a truce that satisfies everybody, because ultimately, in any scenario, those who are working somewhere in an industry, they want to be able to have enough to live on, to work under complete safety conditions and health conditions. And this is inevitably going to come into conflict with what the precepts are of an industry. And those that run an industry, their main motivation is to get as much out of their workforce as cheaply as possible. Similarly, in terms of rural areas, you think about people who are working on land, whether they have certain entitlements on that land or whether they are landless laborers. I mean, if they're landless laborers, then they have very limited rights, if any. They can be evicted from a piece of land that they might have been tilling. They can have if they have any kind of animals, they can be taken from them by landlords, and they can use the power of the state and the police to that effect as well. Therefore, you have inherent conflict built into a situation. And this isn't just true of India, it's true all over the world. We are now living under a world of a pandemic. And in this scenario, I mean, even in the ivory towers of the academy in the British university sector, we are going to be facing cuts and job losses because the vice chancellors are saying that they cannot afford as many academics, they cannot afford as many staff. And therefore, there are redundancies which are going to be taking place. In fact, redundancies are already happening in some British universities. And therefore, you cannot square a circle. The problem with Gandhi is that his personal prescription for society, based as it was on his own notions of his own personal religious ideas. It's something which is predicated on this notion that you can somehow have peace in the existing world, and you can just paper over some of the deeper problems about the world that we live in. And I don't think that is possible. So, of course, many people wish to look towards Gandhi for leadership. But I think it is interesting. I mean, even with the Extinction Rebellion in the UK, although many of the protests began by being non-violent and as I said earlier, by not resisting when they were being arrested, many subsequently then have tried to resist arrest by the police. And therefore this has broken out into further conflict. And that's because I think that it's only when a struggle is tested in the real world that's really when the participants have to make judgments for themselves as to what their particular tactic or their particular strategy is going to be. And I think it's in that scenario that some of the weaknesses of Gandhi's strategy comes up, because for Gandhi, the issue was always to turn the other cheek. Well, how many times is one expected to turn the other cheek and offer the other cheek if one's going to be slapped around constantly? Now, let me make very clear, that does not mean to say that I am arguing in favor of violence or some kind of bloodthirsty sense of revenge against the powers that be. I want to see peaceful rebellion. But I suppose my question as a historian, and when I look throughout history, is that there has never been a peaceful kind of transformation in society. Even with the suffragette movement that we celebrated the centenary of a couple of years ago in Britain in terms of women gaining the right to vote, the suffragette movement did not achieve that without a resort to direct and, in some cases, forceful action. And I think it just means that we have to probe these kinds of issues much deeper, rather than just accepting Gandhi and those who are his adherents at face value alone. I think if we do that, then we are doing a great disservice to both Gandhi and to the kinds of political movements and questions of activism that people may be engaged with.
Thank you so much for patiently answering all the questions. I mean, thank you certainly for that insightful talk. I think we will wind up today's discussion. On behalf of Department of English, North Orissa University, I express my warm and heartfelt gratitude to Professor Talat Ahmed for sparing time for us, for addressing us, for an extremely engaging discussion. And as we have seen with the number of responses and the varied responses to a talk, we can easily gauge how Gandhi continues to be an important figure, not only in the sense that a lot of people admire him, but that a lot of people are very inquisitive in finding out about Gandhi. We are thankful to you, ma'am, for the talk, and I'm thankful to our audience, our viewers who joined us today for the session. And I would like to tell them that we will be back with the third part of this series on the 2nd of October. We will be joined by Dr. Prabha Ravishankar of SNDT Women's University, Mumbai. She'll be speaking on a very important theme again. She'll be talking on Gandhi and friendship, and she'll be speaking on Gandhi's friendship with this publisher from Chennai, erstwhile Madras presidency, G. Nattesan. So we'll be back in another week's time. Thank you so much to our esteemed speaker and to our audience. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.